Hello, welcome to our banter in the lead up to the next Christchurch Camerata concert, which is the first in more than a year because of COVID. David Banney will be conducting. He's our cameraman here today. It's coming up on the 22nd of May, which is the day after the election. Don't forget to vote. And it will feature a work by one of the players in the Camerata, the principal violist, Paul Groh, who is with me now. Hello, Paul.
Hello, Paul.
This piece is a serenade.
Yes, it is.
Now, you're not the first to write a string serenade. There's a long history of this.
No, and by some noteworthy composers like Tchaikovsky, Dvorak, and Elgar.
I think the Camerata have performed, all of those works in the past?
Yes, all of them,
okay,
and we'll be performing the Elgar on the same concert. So a traditional serenade plus a new one.
Okay, so why write a new string serenade?
Well, when David first asked me to compose something for Camerata, I wanted to write something, first of all, that wasn't too difficult, something that a good youth orchestra could play. And that got me thinking about my own childhood and the impressions that music made on me when I was young. And the result was a short piece called the Discovery Overture, which was inspired by the music in the nature documentaries I used to enjoy on television when I was young.
Hang on, so you watched environmental documentaries, but were inspired by the music in those documentaries?
Yes,
wow.
They had wonderful music, things like the National Geographic specials and the Jacques Cousteau programs.
Okay.
Beautiful music on these, and very exciting theme music as well. And so I had that in mind, and that became the basis for the piece. I was very happy with the way it turned out. So for my next one, I wanted to go back to the same well, so to speak, but with a larger scale work in several movements, a serenade. This is something that composers tend to want to prove themselves with, to see that they can.
So a string serenade means that there's no, what you might call, colour instruments, the flutes, the trumpets, it's just the violins.
Just the string orchestra.
Just the string orchestra.
Mm-hmm.
So there's
But there's plenty of colour in that.
Yes, I didn't mean there's no colour in the string. But there's, I guess, a logistical reason to write string serenades too, because then you can just use the string section of an orchestra, or in the case of Camerata, which is fundamentally the core orchestra, is a string orchestra.
Yes, and the best reason is that I play in a string orchestra.
That's right.
And I found out long ago it just isn't worthwhile writing music for something that, if I don't have a particular performance in mind.
So there's a long tradition and heaps of music written for string quartet. Is this kind of a string quartet where instead of one instrument playing each part, you've got a number of instruments? Is it kind of just a big string quartet?
Not exactly, because in the first place there's a double bass section, which is added to that, and it's very important. In a lot of it yes, the bass is double the cellos at the octave. But it is a section in its own right, and not only that, but in some places the individual string sections are divided. And you have that, for example, at the beginning of the second movement, where it begins in the low strings with the divided violas and cellos plus bass, and then it's answered by the divided first and second violins.
So you get a richer harmony.
Yes. So you have upper strings and lower strings, but both in four-part harmony.
Okay. So that's kind of what a string serenade is. Is your string serenade still coming, you said it's coming from the same inspirational pool.
Yes.
So does that mean it still is coming from the place that the music of those environmental documentaries?
Oh, no, not
okay.
from that, but what I meant was it's coming from impressions of music from my childhood, from when I was growing up. What music meant to me then, and just thinking about that. So there are several different examples of that.
Where did you grow up? I hesitate to say it's US because Canadians get very offended.
Well, I grew up in Detroit, which is right on the border with Canada, so I talk like a Canadian.
Okay, right.
But I am an American, or I'm an Australian citizen.
Yes, of course. You've been here what?
20 years.
Yeah. Okay. This is taking you back to your childhood in Detroit.
Yes.
Okay.
Or it could have been anywhere, but it's just what the music did. Now, the movements don't have titles, but if they did, the first movement would be called Saturday Morning. Like a lot of children of my generation, I spend my Saturday mornings in front of the television set watching cartoons and children's programming. And the music in these shows also made a very big impression on me. It's very, very cheerful, very fun sort of music. And so I tried to get that sort of quality in the themes that I used, although in the development section it gets quite dramatic.
Okay, so that's the first movement, Saturday morning.
Yes.
What does the second
That's
movement
it's not a title. They don't have titles, but if it had a title, it would be Saturday Morning. And if the second...
Sorry to interrupt you there, but there's a
Certainly.
kind of an argument, isn't there, amongst classical musicians as to whether they do give titles. Some composers do, generally titles to things from the publisher. The composers have this thing, I don't want to give it a title. Why is that?
Oh, no. In the old days, sometimes a publisher would give the work a title that would become known by, like Mozart's Jupiter Symphony.
Yeah, that's kind of a marketing.
Yes, exactly. Well, with Mendelssohn's Hebrides Overture, which was the title he gave it, his publisher put out a second edition under the title Fingal's Cave, so he could sell twice as many copies. It was considered fair business practice in those days.
In your case, do you kind of not want to give it the title Saturday Morning because you don't want the audience to be kind of getting locked into thinking?
Not
what does
really.
It mean,
It's
morning?
because the title says it works as absolute music. The movements in some cases do tell stories, but these are stories that I just sort of made up on my own as a guide to interpreting. Just as a player, I play a piece of absolute music like the Telemann Viola Concerto, but I'll think of a story to go with it to just to have something to say and to convey some sort of feelings that go with it.
But you come up with the story.
Yes.
Whereas if he gave it a title, then he'd be leading you in a particular direction, which may be different.
That's true, and it's important for performers to come up with stories. It doesn't have to be the same story, but it helps if you come up with your own, that it's something personal.
And I guess it helps you as a composer as well, when you're writing.
I would say so, yes.
So, second movement?
Well, the second movement, like the first, doesn't have a title, but if it did, it would be Sunday Morning.
Oh, okay.
Sunday Morning. This is about being in church and listening to the choir and the organ, and this was also a very big impression on me when I was growing up. And this movement actually does have a little story that I made up to kind of fit the form of the piece. It's about a boy and a girl who are singing in the church choir. They're sitting across from each other in the choir stalls, and they like each other, but they can't do anything about it because they're in church. So they keep looking at each other and thinking about each other during the service while the hymns are going on. And that's why the first and second themes in that movement are very similar. I did that on purpose. It's not because I ran out of ideas. But the first time it's a hymn tune, and the second time it's a love song, so the feeling is different.
Okay. So there's four movements.
Yes.
The third movement.
And the third movement, like the others, doesn't have a title, but if it did, the title that it doesn't have would be Octaves.
Right.
Octaves. When I was taking piano lessons as a very small boy, I noticed early on that a lot of piano playing consists of playing in octaves. Octaves in the left hand, octaves in the right hand, octaves, octaves, octaves. So I remember at one point, I was sitting at the piano just fooling around and playing octaves at random and singing octaves, 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 octaves. I don't know how often I did that. I remember it annoyed my sister, but I
think
just
that's the role of the brother.
Well, I just that popped into my mind at some point while I was writing the piece, and all of a sudden I knew exactly what the theme should be in that, and The first 14 bars just kind of came to me right there. So it's a theme that is built on octaves, but the idea came from just being a small child, noticing things about how music works and having fun with them, which is a big part of what composing is all about.
Okay. And the fourth movement?
Okay. And the fourth movement
doesn't have a title, but if
it doesn't have a title, but the main theme in it is from a German nursery song, which does. And that title is Hoppa Hoppa Reiter. Hoppa Hoppa Reiter is a German nursery song. My grandfather used to sing it to me when I was a little boy, bouncing me on his knee. It's Hoppa Hoppa Reiter, wenn fällt, dann schreit fällt in den Graben, fressen ihn die Raben, fällt in den Sumpf, gibt's nur einen Plumpf. And then you straighten your leg and the child slides down to your foot and he gets up and says, Nachmal, Nachmal, again. And that was a very early experience I had with music as something fun to do, something fun in a physical way. I just wanted to do it over again.
What a great grandfather song.
It is. He was a great grandfather. But now if you know anything about German nursery rhymes or fairy tales, you won't be surprised that the words are actually kind of morbid. It's basically, giddy up rider, when he falls then he'll scream. If he falls in the ditch, the ravens will devour him, but if he falls in the swamp, there will only be a splash.
That's very German.
That's it. And this movement has a little story to it as well, that I just came up. It's about an old man who says to his grandson, "Now, Paulus, today we're going to go horseback riding. Now, it might seem scary, but trust me, there's nothing to worry about. I know what I am doing. I was in the cavalry. My grandfather was in the cavalry." And the horse hears this and he says, "Oh, so you were in the cavalry, were you, with the spurs and the whip and all that?" Okay, we'll see about that. So they get on the horse, and the horse just takes off at high speed, as fast as he can, and the grandfather's all worried because he thinks he's going to fall in the ditch and get devoured by ravens, but the boy's having the time of his life. So it's just kind of a wild ride. It's a very fun, very lively music to end the piece.
It sounds fantastic. I know from, not that I know anything about composition, but I know from talking to people who know about composition that your composition style is very good. It's a very well-formed, satisfying form of composing. Where do you get your style of actually putting things together?
Well, that's just it. It depends on the actual piece and what I'm trying to say. And I'm glad you actually pointed out that I do have a style. Once when I was applying to graduate schools, I was rejected from one. And when I found out, I got the comments from my interview, and one of the points was, lacks a distinct focus of style.
Okay.
And I said, well, you know, here I was maybe 22 years old. Why should I have
It takes people years and years and years.
Yes, but I, at the interview they kept asking me, well, what kind of composer are you? Are you a 12-tone composer? Are you a minimalist composer? And tried to put me in categories. And I said, no, I like to be able to move around between categories. So I've written music that's very avant-garde, very dissonant, uses a lot of extended techniques. But the Serenade, I'm working in a style of the 1800s. A very traditional style, and
where those serenades
yes,
you mentioned
exactly,
yeah.
And just trying to work in that. Most modernists or composers will tell you, "Oh, I could write pretty music if I wanted to. I just don't want to."
Yeah.
You never hear them put to the test. Maybe they could, but it wouldn't be a good piece if their heart wasn't in it. But this is a very personal piece to me.
These days, I know from Elena Katz-Chen, the Australian composer, that she is similar to you in that she could write music like that, but kind of goes, if it frightens my son, I don't want to write it. Why would I want to write music that frightens my son?
Yes, and she is a very diverse, very versatile, composer, and who's written some wonderful viola music as well.
Yeah. Well, Paul, it's one part of a multi-part concert, obviously, including, as you said, the Elgar Serenade, so we can compare. You feel intimidated by Elgar?
I don't feel intimidated by Elgar. His piece is more sophisticated than mine, I'll give him that. Mine is on a bigger scale.
Oh, wow.
And the Elgar Serenade only has 3 movements. but each one is a little gem.
Okay.
Mine is a little more. It's the first and last movements are in sonata allegro form, and it lasts altogether about 25 minutes. The Elgar is a little bit shorter than that, but
people do love the Elgar, and even if they don't know Elgar Serenade, I know how that goes. Even if they can't think of it, when they hear it, they'll know bits, and it'll certainly be something that people can feel familiar with, preparing them for something that they're not familiar with.
Well, it's nice because we're having two pairs of pieces in similar styles, but written in different eras.
There's also music by David Banney, who is also here. So let's find out more about what else is happening in the concert and bring David into the conversation. Come out from behind the camera, David Banney, who'll be conducting the concert on Sunday the 22nd of May. Hello.
How are you?
So we've been talking to Paul Groh, who has a piece in the concert. You also have a piece in the concert.
Yeah.
It's a shame we can't talk to Elgar, but you know, we only have so much power. But
Vivaldi would be even harder to conjure up.
So tell us about your piece.
Actually, one of the interesting things, saying we can't speak to Elgar, but one of the things that for me is wonderful about classical music is that actually every time we open the score, Elgar is talking to us.
Yeah.
And
he's telling you about the hills. What were the hills he used to ramble over?
Yes.
Somewhere in the UK.
Yeah, that's right. I should know because my teacher, Handel, was one of the great Elgar conductors. But you can, even if you've never been there, you can feel the mist and the clouds in every bar of Elgar.
Yeah. So what do we feel in your music? Where are we?
Well, this piece was written during the pandemic, and me also being a violist like Paul, and having a number of viola students. Unlike the violin and even the cello, there's unfortunately a lack of good music at certain sort of difficulty levels for viola students, and it's not too hard to find music for beginner violas, and there's plenty of fantastic music for really advanced violas. But in the middle, there's heaps and heaps of violin sonatas of Telemann, Handel, Corelli, Vivaldi, Beethoven, Mozart that aspiring sort of middle teenagers can reach, but for the viola, not so many. So I started writing some pieces specifically with good young viola players in mind, and
it seems crazy to me that in the 21st century there is still a niche that you can find to fill with viola music. How on earth has that come?
Well, I think partly because of the history of the instruments, and often what would happen in the courts where a lot of music was played. I think there's two things. One is that the situation of the viola in the orchestra means that it's sort of like the tenor section of the choir.
That's the most important section.
Of course it is. But unlike the tenors in the operas where they're the stars, the tenors in the choir often have not to say a less important part, but a less melodic part, and often the sopranos that will have the tune. In fact, interestingly, if you go back far enough, the word tenor it comes from the word tenere, which means to hold, and literally the tenors were the people that held the tune.
Yeah.
But that's actually in the days when men were the singers and the tenors were the highest, so they were the holding the tune on top. Altos, which we think of as being underneath the sopranos, the word alto relates to being even on top of that, altitude, all of those things. So the altos were on top of the tenors. Soprano literally means on the top, so when they came along they were on the top. But if you go back far enough into Renaissance music, actually often the tune is in the tenor part, but not
the viola part.
By the time instrumental music really came to the fore. That was the Baroque period, so Bach, Handel, those composers. And so the tenor part, if it was too busy, the music sounds too busy. And the viola is rich, beautiful instrument. It doesn't speak as quickly as the violin. And
what does that mean?
That means you actually need to work the strings a little harder to get them to actually ring. And you just
so a little bit isn't such a viola.
Not so successful on the viola as it is on the violin.
It turns into marshmallow.
Yeah, it can do. And also because it doesn't play in the highest register so easily as the violin, I think that's just tended to be that people wrote more for the violin, and there are some notable exceptions. You know, Telemann wrote a great concerto, the Sixth Brandenburg Concerto of Bach for two violas. Yep. There are other pieces, but they often tend to be really quite difficult, and so sort of a bit further, you know, a few rungs down the ladder, not so much music.
So is that what this is?
That's what this is.
Okay.
So mind you, this has got in the last movement, and I'm very glad that Paul Groh is playing this, because in the last movement I put a little section for the first solo viola that I knew was going to stretch people a lot, and Paul is absolutely nailing it. So this the last movement, the first viola part, is definitely not an amateur youth part. It's definitely a professional viola part.
So you've been composing this during COVID?
Yeah.
You've been composing a lot during COVID.
Yes, I have.
What have you learned through this whole COVID compositional era?
One of the really interesting things was I'm always on the lookout for music that's going to suit performances and also students, and there's a great website that people might know called the Petrucci Music Library, which is sort of like a Wikipedia for music that's out of copyright, and it's got pretty much everything that you could ever imagine having been composed that's out of copyright. And I was actually looking for Italian Baroque composers at the same time as Vivaldi and Corelli, and looking, is there any good viola music of those people? And I came across this fellow called Nicola Canzano, and I thought, that sounds like a fantastic Italian Baroque composer, and looked him up, and there were these pieces that looked absolutely like Baroque music. Then I discovered that he's alive and well, living in Manhattan in New York, and affiliated with the Juilliard School, and he's really an expert. He's a harpsichord player, that's his main instrument, and really an expert on Baroque music. And the only music that he writes is in the style of Baroque composers. And that led me to read more about him and more about how he teaches, and to my shock and horror, for the first time in my short life, to learn actually how harmony and composition was taught in Bach and Handel's time. And one of the things that really surprised me was even by the time Bach and Handel came along, the idea of chords as we think of them actually hadn't been invented yet. And having investigated some of these ideas, suddenly Bach and Handel, Vivaldi, all makes total sense.
Although Bach wrote chorales which are full of chords.
They are, and in fact it was around the same time that Rameau, who was over in France, was looking at all of this harmony that all of these composers were writing. Same with Handel, you know, and you can analyse Bach, Handel, Vivaldi in the same way that we analyse chords. So by chords we mean we can call that chord 1, chord 5, chord 1, and the reason is that if we make a chord on that note and then go up 5 notes and make a chord there's 2 chords, so we call that chord 1, chord 5, chord 1, and we put those together. But Rameau deduced this from what was already happening. And prior to this, what people were interested in was actually, if you take a bass line, let's take a bass line like, for example, just like that, what intervals are you allowed to put above that? What intervals sound good? It's not so much what's allowed, but what sounds good. And so if we start very simply, if I have, this is a G, so the first thing that will sound good up in the top is the same note. But then if I move the bass line up, that doesn't sound good, so I'm going to move that to there. So now the next note is, I could stay there, but it sounds a little bit dark, so they would go back to there, and then that works. That sounds very harsh. That sounds better. That's okay. I could do that, but that's a bit boring, the same note, so I go up to there. And so, for example, we've already got this series of sets of notes in the right hand that sound beautiful over the top of the left hand, but the composers weren't thinking of them as chords. And so, for example, there's on this note, the first note in the bass, that those notes work, so they all sound good. What Rameau realised was that if we go up 2 notes, it's actually the same notes that work. Same notes that work.
That sounds more boring.
Yeah, that does sound more boring. But then Rameau realised that these are actually all the same, and so we could call this chord 1. And when it comes back again, we can still call it chord 1. And for example, when we get to that note, the notes that are there are the same notes as the notes that are there. And so he said, let's call this chord 5, because it's based on this idea of a triad.
So they had chords, they just didn't have chord theory, where they had names for everything.
Correct.
And this works with this, and so no one had written the textbook.
Correct. Well, they'd written
them,
heaps
but
of
they just
textbooks.
kind of...
In fact, there were textbooks galore, but not talking about chords and chord numbers.
Because if you watch, and on YouTube these days you can watch a million things about jazz, how it fits. So every chord has a name, and sometimes it's a name that's a million different numbers.
Yeah.
So that's what they didn't have.
Not yet,
Okay.
no.
Right.
And so, but they understood very well what intervals work. And then there was, so if you were a keyboard player presented, say I was accompanying Paul Groh playing the Telemark Viola Concerto, the bass line might go, and then there would be a series of numbers that would be the bass line, and above that I would know that can work, but then that's what I'm going to do on that note.
Yeah.
So they hadn't worked out yet that this is a G major chord and this is a D major chord. We just knew that above those notes that will sound good, and above there. And the melody, so the first level of this tuition, and all of this came from Naples in Italy, this very, very highly sophisticated way of teaching. So the first level of learning would be just for keyboard players. So if I'm accompanying Paul, and I've got this bass line, and there will be numbers above each note to tell me what intervals were permissible, and the keyboard players just became second nature to them. So just like reading a chord chart for a guitarist. Then also,
It's not COVID.
Not COVID. Then we could also use this to make a melody. So. Yeah, absolutely. And so for the composers would build these same ideas into melodies. And one of then all sorts of tricks would come into it. So for example, we know that if I do that and then that's got to go there. But if I let this first note just hang a little bit, then it's suddenly more interesting.
So they first worked out this goes with this, but if you just stick to that, then everyone's doing the same thing. So you've then got to figure out how to make it more interesting.
That's right.
Okay.
Yes.
So where does all this is what you've been learning during COVID, but
yeah.
how does it then feed into
this?
Into what you...
So, for example, in the slow movement, this is a concerto for 2 violas.
I don't mean to interrupt you incidentally, but we did start this little session with an aim of something like 6 minutes. I think that's well and truly gone.
Yeah. So if we think of the bass line in the slow movement of this, that's the bass line of the slow movement. And now then, what could I do above that? So that's what the cellos will be doing. And so the first viola, if we think, that all works, and they're exactly using the rules that Handel and Co would have used, but it's a bit boring. So it's more interesting. I should have gone, but I delay it because it's a suspension. And then now there's a canon. So while the first viola goes up to here, the second violin plays the same thing. And then we put together first viola. those ideas. In the first movement, the very first, it starts with a little overture, which starts with, which is an unusual one, but permissible. And then the bass line goes to there, and now if that's where I started in the melody, can't do that. So now I have to go to there. So these are using all of these techniques that Handel and Co would use. And it's
what kind of piece is this? So it's for string orchestra?
Yes, and you would officially call it a Concerto Grosso. So a concerto is a piece for a solo instrument and an orchestra. A Concerto Grosso simply means that the concerto part is a team of people instead of a single person. And that was very common in the Baroque period.
Handel did a million.
Yes, and so in fact in this concert we've got 2 concerti grossi, this one for 2 violas and orchestra, then the Vivaldi one for 2 violins, cello and orchestra. And so in fact by the end of the first 2 pieces, the audience will have heard our principal violins, our principal viola and our principal cello all playing solos, which is a nice thing.
I don't know whether it's permissible to say this, but I know that because of COVID feeds into basically every performance decision you have to make these days. And one of those performance decisions is you don't know what players are going to be COVID-free on the day of any concert that you plan. And so what you've skillfully done is come up with a program for this concert that can be adequately performed without certain players, obviously not without key players, but without certain players you can still do it.
We can, and we've also, there exists an email, which is the contingency plan, so that if this person gets sick, someone else can play their part. The only person that can't get sick is Paul Groh, because nobody can play his first viola part.
What about you?
Well, I think the orchestra could play unconducted. Otherwise I can conduct from Zoom.
What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got Vivaldi, we've got Banney, we've got Elgar, we've got Groh.
Yeah.
That sounds like a deal to me.
Fantastic.
A good antidote after the election. This is the first day after the election, and everyone will be in a mood to have something festive. So this sounds like a good way.
And I've heard both leaders have promised that they'll finish COVID.
Oh, good. Yes, right. It'll be finished.
So whoever you vote for, COVID will be over on the 21st of May.
How do we get tickets?
There'll be a link from the Camerata website, and there'll also certainly be tickets available at the door on the day.
Concert is on Sunday, the 22nd of May at 2 p.m. here at the Cathedral.
So 2. I can't remember.
We did this last time, David. We did it last time. We were never going to do it again.
If that's wrong, there'll be a big sign on the screen to say yes or no. Yeah, I just turn up and do what I'm told.
Paul Groh was our guest earlier in this very long video, but his piece will be the last in the concert, and David Banney will be conducting and playing and being composers. Hope you've enjoyed this banter, and we'll see you again for the next concert, which is coming up very soon.